The autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and danger across the Nebraska plains as 16-year-old Ayanna pressed herself against the weathered barn wall. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon where dust clouds marked the path of the raiders who had destroyed her village just hours before. The Lakota girl's hands trembled as she clutched the small medicine bundle her grandmother had thrust into her arms before pushing her toward the hidden escape route. Thomas McKenna paused in his evening chores, sensing movement near his property. The Irish rancher had learned to trust his instincts during his 15 years on the frontier. Something was different tonight. The usual sounds of settling cattle and evening birds seemed muted, replaced by an unsettling quiet that made the hair on his neck stand up. Ayanna had been running for most of the day, following the creek bed her grandfather had shown her summers ago. The bandits had come at dawn. Not the blue-coated soldiers her people had grown to fear, but something worse. Desperate men with wild eyes and no honor, seeking whatever they could steal or destroy. Her village had scattered like leaves in a storm, families disappearing into the tall grass and hidden ravines that had protected the Lakota for generations. The rancher's weathered hands stilled on the gate latch as he caught sight of movement near his barn. In the fading light, he could make out a small figure huddled against the wooden structure. Years of frontier life had taught him caution. But something about the way the figure moved, careful and frightened, rather than threatening, made him approach slowly, rather than reach for his rifle. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat as heavy footsteps approached. She had hoped to rest here until darkness provided better cover. But now she prepared to run again. Her legs ached from the day's flight, and her moccasins were worn thin from the rocky ground along the creek. When the tall figure rounded the corner of the barn, she forced herself to stand straight despite her fear. Thomas stopped several feet away, taking in the sight of the young Lakota woman. Her traditional dress was torn and dusty. Her long black hair had escaped its braids, and her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been running for her life. But her dark eyes held a dignity that reminded him of his own daughter. Lost to fever, 3 winters passed. "Can I stay here until those bandits move on?" Ayanna asked in careful English, her voice barely above a whisper but steady despite her trembling hands. She had learned the white man's language from the mission school before her father had pulled her away, saying the teachers wanted to steal more than just words from his people. The rancher studied her face in the gathering dusk. He had heard the distant sounds of conflict earlier in the day, the kind of chaos that usually meant trouble for everyone in the territory. His own small spread was isolated enough that raiders typically passed by, but he knew the dangers a young woman alone would face on the open plains. Thomas nodded once, a simple gesture that carried the weight of an unspoken promise. He had lost too much to violence and hatred already. His wife Margaret had died in a Cheyenne raid 5 years ago, but he had learned to separate the actions of desperate people from the character of entire nations. This girl posed no threat to him, and turning her away would be the same as signing her death warrant. Ayanna felt her knees weaken with relief at the silent agreement. She had prepared herself for rejection, for the need to run again into the dangerous night. Instead, this weathered man with kind eyes was offering her sanctuary, asking nothing in return but trusting her word about the nature of her flight. The rancher gestured toward his small cabin, but Ayanna shook her head and pointed to the barn. Sleeping under the same roof as a white man, even one showing kindness, would create complications neither of them needed. She had no wish to bring trouble to someone willing to help her, and her presence in his home would be difficult to explain if others came looking. Thomas understood her reasoning and nodded toward the barn's interior. The structure was solid and warm, filled with sweet hay that would provide comfortable bedding. He had built it himself, with thick walls that would muffle sound and heavy doors that could be secured from the inside. She would be safe there, at least for the night. As darkness settled over the plains, Ayanna made a small nest in the hayloft, positioning herself where she could watch both the main door and the small window that faced the direction she had come. The familiar sounds of settling animals below provided comfort, reminding her of happier times when her people's horses would gentle for the night in similar shelters. Thomas returned to his cabin, but sleep did not come easily. He found himself listening for sounds that might indicate the bandits had tracked the girl to his property. His rifle rested within easy reach, and he had secured the extra ammunition in case the night brought unwanted visitors. The decision to help her had been instinctive, but he knew it carried risks that could cost him everything he had worked to build. In the barn, Ayanna whispered prayers of gratitude to the spirits of her ancestors, asking them to watch over the kind stranger who had shown mercy to one of their descendants. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult choices, but tonight she was warm and relatively safe, protected by walls built by a man who had chosen compassion over fear. Dawn brought the sound of approaching horses, their hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth in a rhythm that spoke of men riding with purpose. Ayanna had slept fitfully, waking at every small sound throughout the night. Now she pressed herself against the barn wall, peering through a gap in the wooden slats as 6 riders approached the ranch buildings. Thomas emerged from his cabin, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had faced danger before. He carried his coffee cup in one hand, projecting an image of morning routine even as his other hand stayed close to the pistol at his hip. The riders were exactly what he had expected. Rough men with hard faces and weapons worn from use rather than display. The leader of the group, a man with a scarred face and cold blue eyes, dismounted and approached the porch. His companions remained on horseback, positioning themselves to watch all approaches to the property. Their movements spoke of military training gone bad, discipline corrupted by desperation and greed. "Morning," the scarred man called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that fooled no one. "Name's Carter. We're tracking some Indians who raided a settlement north of here. You seen any sign of them passing through?" Ayanna held her breath, knowing that her life hung on the rancher's next words. Through the gap in the boards, she could see Thomas take a slow sip of his coffee, using the moment to study the men before him. His weathered face showed nothing but mild interest, as if discussing the weather rather than matters of life and death. "Haven't seen any Indians," Thomas replied, his Irish accent softening the hard consonants. "Been pretty quiet out here." "What kind of raid are we talking about?" Carter's eyes narrowed as he scanned the ranch buildings, taking note of the well-maintained structures and the obvious prosperity of the small operation. "Bad one. They killed some good people, stole livestock and supplies. We aim to make sure they pay for what they done." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the half-truths and deliberate omissions in the man's story. In his years on the frontier, he had learned to read between the lines when men spoke of conflicts with native peoples. Too often, the full truth revealed a more complicated picture than the simple stories of innocent victims and savage attackers. "Terrible thing," Thomas agreed, maintaining his conversational tone. "Though I have to say, most of the Indians through here have been peaceful enough, mostly just passing through, following the old trails their people have used for generations." One of the mounted men, younger than the others with nervous energy that spoke of inexperience, urged his horse forward. "We found tracks leading this direction, fresh ones, made within the last day or so." Ayanna felt her heart racing as she watched the exchange. The young man's eagerness to prove himself made him dangerous in a way that the leader's calculated cruelty did not. Inexperienced men often acted without thinking, creating chaos that served no one's interests. Thomas set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of his porch, his movement casual but positioning him closer to the rifle that rested just inside his door. "Well, you're welcome to look around if you think it'll help. Though I should mention that I've had some trouble with wolves lately. Been tracking them myself. And their prints might be what you're seeing." The scarred leader studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. Something in the rancher's demeanor suggested he was not a man to be easily intimidated or deceived. Carter had survived this long by knowing when to press an advantage and when to avoid unnecessary conflicts. "Wolves, you say?" Carter mused, his tone suggesting he didn't believe the explanation, but was willing to play along for the moment. "Funny thing about tracks, though. Sometimes what looks like wolf prints can tell a different story to someone who knows how to read them properly." Thomas shrugged, maintaining his relaxed posture while keeping his senses alert for any sign that the situation was about to turn violent. "Could be. I'm no expert tracker, just a man trying to protect his livestock. You gentlemen are certainly welcome to take a look around if you think it would help your search." The invitation was delivered with just enough confidence to suggest that Thomas had nothing to hide, while simultaneously challenging the men to either accept his word or openly accuse him of deception. It was a calculated risk, but one based on his assessment that these men preferred easier targets than a prepared rancher on his own land. Ayanna watched as two of the riders dismounted and began examining the ground around the ranch buildings. Her stomach twisted with fear as one of them approached the barn, his eyes scanning the structure for signs of recent disturbance. She had been careful to avoid leaving obvious tracks, but she knew that determined searchers might find evidence of her presence. The young man who had mentioned the tracks called out from near the corral. "Hey, Carter. Come look at this. These prints here. They don't look like wolf tracks to me." Thomas felt tension coiling in his muscles as the situation moved toward a more dangerous phase. The tracks the young man had found were likely from Ayanna's approach the previous evening, and trained eyes would quickly identify them as human rather than animal. He needed to redirect their attention before they had time for a thorough examination. "Those would be mine," Thomas said, walking toward the corral with measured steps. "I was checking on the horses last evening, making sure that Wolfpack hadn't been nosing around the fence line. Lost a calf to them just last week." Carter followed, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol in a gesture that was not quite threatening but certainly not reassuring. The dynamic between the two men had shifted from polite conversation to a more serious evaluation of resolve and capability. The searcher near the barn had found the spot where Ayanna had rested against the wall, and his sharp eyes noted the slight depression in the dust, and a few threads from her dress caught on the rough wood. He opened his mouth to call attention to his discovery, but a sudden commotion from the direction of the main trail interrupted him. Another group of riders was approaching, but these wore the blue uniforms of the territorial cavalry. Their arrival changed everything about the situation, as both Thomas and Carter recognized that the presence of official authority would complicate whatever plans the bandits might have had for dealing with the rancher. Lieutenant James Morrison dismounted with the practiced efficiency of a career soldier, his weathered face taking in the scene before him with sharp intelligence. The 6 men gathered at the ranch bore the unmistakable signs of trouble, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a saber. His 8 troopers remained mounted, positioned to respond quickly to whatever might develop. "Gentlemen," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison, 3rd Cavalry. We're investigating reports of armed raiders in this area. I trust you won't mind if we ask a few questions about your business here." Carter's jaw tightened as his plans suddenly became far more complicated. Dealing with a lone rancher was one thing, but federal cavalry represented a level of authority that could not be intimidated or eliminated without creating problems that would follow him across multiple territories. His men shifted nervously, recognizing that their situation had become precarious. "No problem at all, Lieutenant," Carter replied, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "We're tracking some Indians who raided a settlement. Just asking this gentleman here if he'd seen any sign of them passing through his property." Morrison's experienced gaze moved between the bandits and Thomas, reading the subtle signs of tension and deception that years of frontier service had taught him to recognize. Something about Carter's story felt rehearsed, and the way his men were positioned suggested they were prepared for conflict rather than simple tracking. "Indians, you say?" Morrison asked, his tone neutral but his attention sharp. "That's interesting, because we just came from the Lakota village about 15 miles north of here. Found it burned out, but the evidence suggests it was white men who did the raiding, not Indians." Ayanna felt a surge of grief and rage at the confirmation of her worst fears. Her village, her people, the children and elders who had trusted in the protection of distance and treaties, all destroyed by these murderers who now stood in the yard below her hiding place. Her hands clenched into fists as she fought the urge to reveal herself and demand justice. Thomas saw the subtle change in Carter's expression, the momentary tightening around his eyes that revealed the man's recognition that his story had been exposed as a lie. The rancher positioned himself slightly closer to his cabin door, knowing that violence might erupt at any moment. "Must be some mistake, Lieutenant," Carter said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "We heard about that village being hit, but it was Indians who did it. Some rival tribe, maybe, or renegades who didn't want to follow the treaties." Morrison stepped closer to Carter, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. "The thing about evidence, mister, is that it tells its own story. horseshoe prints from shod horses, spent cartridges from military rifles, and witnesses who managed to escape before you finished your work. The youngest of Carter's men, his nerves finally snapping under the pressure, suddenly spurred his horse toward the trail. Morrison's troopers reacted instantly, 2 of them moving to intercept, while the others drew their weapons and trained them on the remaining bandits. "Nobody moves unless I give the word," Morrison commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air with military precision. "You men are under arrest on suspicion of murder, arson, and raiding federal territory." Carter's hand moved toward his pistol, but Thomas's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," the rancher said quietly, his own weapon now visible in his grip. "The lieutenant has you dead to rights. To be. And I'm not inclined to let murderers ride away from my property." The brief standoff stretched taut as Carter weighed his rapidly dwindling options. His men looked to him for leadership, but the presence of trained cavalry and an armed rancher had eliminated any realistic chance of fighting their way clear. Surrender meant trial and probable hanging, but resistance meant certain death in the next few minutes. Ayanna chose that moment to reveal herself. Climbing down from the barn loft with quiet dignity, despite the danger that still filled the air. Her appearance caused a stir among both groups, but Morrison's expression showed immediate understanding as he connected her presence to the destroyed village. "This is one of the survivors," Thomas said simply, his words carrying the weight of moral authority. "She asked for shelter, and I gave it. These men came looking for her this morning, claiming to be tracking raiders when they were actually the raiders themselves." Morrison nodded grimly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place as he studied Ayanna's torn dress and exhausted appearance. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Ayanna shook her head, her dark eyes fixed on Carter with an intensity that made the bandit leader uncomfortable. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the pain and loss that threatened to overwhelm her. "They came at dawn. They burned everything, killed the elders who could not run, took what they wanted, and destroyed the rest." The young bandit who had tried to flee was brought back at gunpoint, his face pale with the realization that his attempt to escape had only confirmed their guilt. Morrison's troopers had efficiently disarmed the entire group, and now they stood as prisoners awaiting transport to the territorial capital for trial. "Mr. McKenna," Morrison said, turning to Thomas with genuine respect, "I want to thank you for protecting this young woman and for standing with federal authority. Your actions today likely prevented these men from escaping justice for their crimes." Thomas nodded quietly, still processing the morning's events and their implications. He had made a simple choice to show mercy to someone in need, but that choice had led to consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. Looking at Ayanna, he saw strength emerging from her initial fear, a resilience that spoke of a people who had survived much worse trials. "What will happen to her?" Thomas asked, concerned about Ayanna's safety once the cavalry departed with their prisoners. Morrison considered the question carefully, understanding the complexities of the situation. "The territorial government has established provisions for survivors of such attacks. She can be escorted to the agency if she wishes. Or," he looked thoughtfully at Thomas, "she could remain here, if you're willing to provide employment and proper supervision." Ayanna looked between the two men, understanding that her future was being decided in this moment. The agency meant safety but also confinement among strangers. Staying at the ranch meant continuing to live in the shadow of danger, but also the possibility of building something new from the ashes of her old life. "I can work," she said simply, her English clear despite her accent. "I can cook, tend animals, keep house. I will earn my place here if Mr. 2000. McKenna will have me." Thomas met her gaze and saw in it the same determination that had carried him through his own darkest hours. Sometimes survival meant accepting help from unexpected sources, and sometimes it meant offering that same help when the opportunity arose. His nod was barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of a promise that would change both their lives forever.